Mother's Love, Death Without Weeping by Nancy Shepherd Hughes. In this story, a shanty town named Alto do Cruzeiro displays a rather odd type of relationship between mother and child. The major question presented by the researcher was, how are kinship ties ruined by hardships such as poverty and urban migration? The kinship tie we are looking at is one of descent, the tie between mother and child.
You have Death Without Weeping. It starts on page 270, and it's about a woman who comes to me with a dying baby, which I have to carry all the way down and go all the way to this horrible charity hospital where the baby dies, a very violent death, really, from dehydration and diarrhea and dysentery and so forth. But what was shocking was as I carried this dead baby back, tears coursing down my cheeks, and I think the tears were for me. I was furious that I was going to have to go take this baby, return this baby to a poor mother. And I just thought it was inhumane. But when I got there and they saw the woman was with many of her women friends and saw me crying, coitada, they said, engraçada, why is she crying? And I said, well, the baby died. And they said, well, it's only a baby. There's more where they come from.
People originally moved to this area because their property was taken to make way for sugar plantations. This was supposed to be temporary, but has become permanent residence for many of these people. It is one of the poorest areas in the country. This poverty is what is assumed to affect the relationship between mother and child. The life expectancy here is low, at about 40 years of age, and poverty and hunger runs rampant. This poverty has created a certain mentality in mothers, and they expect their infant children to die as a result of their life in extreme poverty. This poverty often leads to a mother-led home and their lack of extended family kinship within the home, which means there's not any form of familial kinship for these mothers attempting to raise children, and they have no support system. So they choose not to develop strong relationships with their children so as not to feel grief when their child dies. The only children they form relationships with are those they feel have a strong chance of survival, or their relationship is delayed because they've waited to form a relationship with a child they believe has survived long enough and that it is safe to nurture this child. Now, of course, the survival of a child here is a bit of a miracle because women are often the only parent in the household, and so they must find jobs. These jobs are often low wage and scab jobs, and it keeps them strong to not become attached to a child who will statistically have a great chance of dying. If they become consumed with grief, they would not continue to have children, and thus a culture would end and a source of income could be cut off. If we look at statistics, it is logical for the women to not become attached to the children based on the numbers. Out of 9.5 births, 5 of the children will die or be stillborn, and there isn't a great likelihood that their child will survive birth or life after. These Alto women differentiate infant death in 2 ways. There is natural causes of death, and then there are deaths that are caused by sorcery or magic.
And really, the mother said, it's better that this one is not really. Now, here's what they were saying. It's not that they had a soul. Yes, definitely they had a soul. But they were pre-human. They were pre-human because they were liminal creatures. They were spirit creatures, that they were on their way to another world, and best not to interrupt them on that path. There are different paths. Not every baby born, they tell me, was meant to live. They were criaturas. I love the word. I think it was very ecologically beautiful. They were creatures of the world. And because of that, they had compassion for them. They often would compare the suffering of an animal with the suffering of a bichinhos, of a little beast. But it wasn't done with any kind of hatred but rather with the way you would treat a beloved creature.
They also recognize when a child is helpless, and they are termed to have child sickness. And this sickness can be divided into 2 categories. It is either chronic or acute. The chronic cases are children who are born weak and do not show any signs of a fight for survival. This can happen at birth, or they can show it later once they have been affected by diarrhea, respiratory infections, and fever. which are all treatable symptoms and cases, but unfortunately, in an area like this, with no funds and no support, children die of these very treatable cases. The acute cases are children who die suddenly, which is the cause of dehydration, fever, and malnutrition. The women see it as a madness and also rabies, which is highly stigmatized in the Alto. So the acute cases are more of the sorcery and magical cases of death. There is a large structural sort of kinship in the way they all accept and perpetuate the indifference to infant death. The women often have midwives who advise them to give up on a child, sometimes telling them not to even wash the child off after birth and to just let them die. All members of the community are aware that in some sense the children could be saved, but they would never intervene. They simply provide condolences to the mothers, and not only that, they couldn't financially intervene and save the children. There are not generally ceremonies, and nobody cries. They simply bury the baby and move on. No documentation is necessary for a child's death, and anyone in the family can report the death. A free voucher for a coffin is granted and limited records are kept. Doctors give vaccines, and they ignore signs of malnutrition and other problems, and often mask the hunger cries with sedatives. The church has even moved towards an indifference to infant death. They do not perform ceremonies and will not baptize a dying child, with all of the institutions turning their backs to the women and simply providing services rather than actually helping them keep their babies alive. It makes sense that the women have become so cold towards their own children. Each governmental system recognizes that the only way to help the children is to raise them out of poverty, and yet they do not mourn the loss of children, nor do they attempt to help mothers keep their children alive. This is because they do not have the resources to bring the town out of extreme poverty. The governmental system itself exists in poverty, which means the women and children do, and so creates the severed kinship ties between mother and child. They have made it normal and routine for an infant or young child to die. So although there is structural kinship for the death of children, meaning they all have become indifferent to death and work as a group to continue to do so, there is no structural kinship to help keep babies alive, because poverty has prevented this from forming. Their lack of nurturing towards children is a form of protection for themselves. If they do not become too attached, they are not consumed by grief once the child is gone. It also allows them to focus their attention on the children who will survive, to give them the best chance of survival. In this case study, it is clear that a mother's love is not always natural and indefinite. The research given has answered Shepard Hughes' question of how are kinship ties ruined by hardships and urban migration. It is clear that without the proper resources and structural support, women cannot form a strong bond with their children, for fear that the grief that results from many deaths would consume them and most likely take their own life.